My mom and dad abandoned me at 15 at my grandpa's house because I was a freak due to my medical issues. Now they're begging me for my inheritance to help my brother get out of his mess. I was just a 15-year-old guy with medical problems when my parents decided I no longer suited them. Freak, my father said to me when they left me at my grandfather's house. Grandpa's house was a grim place, more like a hospital than a home. My days passed in loneliness, the language of my peers was cruel, and their looks were disdainful. They didn't want to deal with someone like me. I remembered a time when my parents were around, when I was loved and cared for. But now that felt foreign and unattainable. I was left to fend for myself, like an old toy thrown in the basement. And all because of the inheritance they're now so desperately asking for. But what should I do? Help them after everything they've done? In the first few weeks, I often cursed them and myself for my problems. I tried to understand what exactly made them abandon me like this. All this time, I dreamed that they would come back and apologize, saying that it was all just a mistake. But there was no apology. Gradually, I realized that my parents had probably planned this for a long time. All their talk of love was just empty phrases. They simply used me as an excuse for their desires. During all this time, Grandpa did his best. He was a kind man, but his old age and his own problems made him unable to fully take care of me. I tried not to bother him, pretending that everything was fine, but sometimes it was impossible to hold back the tears. Grandpa's house was an old and dreary place where time had stopped about 20 years ago. Old photos on the walls spoke of a distant past. Every morning I woke up in my narrow room under the ceiling, with peeling paint hanging from it. My parents' clothes, left here in drawers, reminded me that they were not coming back. I tried not to look at them. Grandpa was a man of few words and kind. He tried to fill the void left by my parents, and sometimes we spent evenings sitting on the porch and listening to the sounds of dusk. He told me about his younger years, about his love for Grandma, who had left him too early. At school, I felt like an alien. My classmates made fun of my medical problems and called me a freak, just like my parents did. I tried to ignore them, but sometimes I came home in the evenings with tears in my eyes. Every day I returned home to Grandpa, who seemed to know what I was feeling. He never asked me too many questions. Sometimes, sitting in my room, I felt that Grandpa could hear me crying, but he never came to comfort me. My encounters with classmates at school became more and more difficult. Whispers behind my back, mockery when the teachers weren't looking. No one wanted to sit next to me in class. It became harder and harder for me to get up in the morning and go to school. I began skipping classes, preferring to stay home. One evening, when I was sitting on the porch and looking at the stars, Grandpa joined me. He didn't say anything, just sat next to me. Grandpa, although kind, had his own demons. His health was deteriorating every day, and I had to take on more and more responsibilities around the house. I learned to cook, clean, and even help Grandpa with his medications. At school, I continued to be an outcast. One day, when I came home with a torn shirt and a black eye, Grandpa just shook his head and said, "You have to be strong, boy." Meanwhile, Grandpa's health worsened. He started spending more time in bed, and I often heard him coughing at night. Alongside this, I began to notice strange calls on the house phone. Grandpa would answer briefly, often cutting the conversation short and hanging up. I asked him who was calling, but he just waved it off and said it wasn't important. But I knew something was up. I need to tell you about my younger brother. My younger brother, Jason, was the golden boy in our parents' eyes. He didn't have the problems I did, and he always enjoyed their unconditional love and support. While I struggled to deal with my difficulties, Jason lived a carefree life, surrounded by attention and care. We rarely talked after I was sent to live with Grandpa. He rarely called and never wrote. But one day, everything changed. One evening, when Grandpa was already asleep, the phone rang. I picked up the receiver and heard a familiar voice. It was Jason. He spoke quickly and excitedly, his voice trembling. He told me he was in big trouble. He got involved in some scam and now owed a huge amount of money. I didn't know how to react. On one hand, I wanted to help him because he was my brother. On the other hand, I felt anger and resentment for being abandoned. Jason continued to explain that our parents couldn't help him. They were desperate and didn't know what to do. He asked me to talk to Grandpa about the potential inheritance that could save him. These words made me furious. They abandoned me, and now they wanted to take advantage of the inheritance that essentially belonged to Grandpa and possibly me. I wanted to hang up, but I restrained myself. Instead, I told Jason I would think about it and call him back later. After that conversation, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts about what to do next swirled in my head. I felt like I was being used again. The next day, I told Grandpa about Jason's call. Grandpa was silent for a long time, then said I had to make the decision myself. Jason kept calling, begging for help. I ignored his calls. A couple of days later, Grandpa called me into his room. He said he wanted to talk about the inheritance. I was surprised, but sat down opposite him and started listening. Grandpa explained that he had savings and property that he wanted to leave to me, but he wasn't sure how to do it right given the situation. He explained that my parents and Jason would likely try to get part of the inheritance, and I needed to be prepared for that. Meanwhile, Jason didn't stop trying. He started sending me messages with photos and videos showing how terrible his situation was. He talked about debts and how he might lose everything he had. One evening, I decided to meet Jason in person. We agreed to meet at a park near the house. When I arrived, Jason looked exhausted and nervous. He started begging me for help again. He talked about how everything in his life was falling apart and that only I could save him. As I listened to him, I suddenly realized that he was using me. He and my parents just wanted to get the money. One evening, when I came home from school, I saw a car parked outside Grandpa's house. It was a new, expensive SUV. When I walked into the house, I was met by a hum of voices. In the living room, sitting on the old couch, were my parents. Mom looked worn out and tense, and Dad was trying to stay calm, but I could see he was nervous. Grandpa was sitting in a chair across from them, his face stern and closed off. I froze at the door, trying to grasp what was happening. My parents had suddenly appeared after all these years, and it turned out they had important business, money for my little brother. Jason was in big trouble and urgently needed help. Yeah, right. With tears in her eyes, Mom begged me to understand them. She tried to explain that they were desperate when they left me and that things were different now. Dad, standing next to her, talked about the need to unite as a family, emphasizing that Jason was really in trouble. Grandpa, sitting still, silently watched our meeting. I knew he was on my side, but he decided not to interfere to give me a chance to figure things out on my own. I promised my parents that I would think about it, but I wasn't ready to give an answer right now. After that, they left, apologizing profusely for their past actions. Grandpa shook his head and told me to think carefully before transferring any money to their account. I had long realized that they were just trying to squeeze the last bit of money out of me. I decided to test something. I set up a bank account that was anonymous, but the condition for withdrawing from this account was that only I could withdraw, transfer, and manage the funds either in person or in my presence. I printed all the account information, except for this small condition. Then I visited my parents. I told them that I had decided to help Jason, but I could only give part of the amount, so I asked them to withdraw a specific sum from the account. They were very grateful to me and said they would do just that. A couple of days later, I received a call from the bank manager. He said that my parents had tried to withdraw the entire amount from the account, but couldn't because they didn't meet the conditions. The manager reported that my parents tried to bribe him to bypass the condition. I called my parents and told them I knew about their attempt to withdraw all the money. I explained that it was a test, and they failed it. Their voices on the phone trembled with fear and anger. They tried to make excuses, but I interrupted them. "You'll never get a cent from me," I said. "Now you'll get what you deserve." I cut all ties with them. I made sure the bank took action against them for attempted fraud. I knew they would have to pay for their actions, and this was my small but fair revenge. Grandpa, learning about this, supported me. I don't know if I did the right thing, but I feel complete relief.